Um, Welcome everyone. Welcome to this very first webinar on how the Information Lab does data. This webinar series is focused on how we as a data company leverage data to make more informed decisions, but also how we help our customers to be more successful in the tools that we specialize in. Now, today we are going to chat about a product we have been working on in a very small team for about a year and a half now, which we called the Learning Hub. And the Learning Hub is an online learning video platform. We'll talk about that a lot more later. Let's actually quickly jump into the agenda of today. First of all, we're going to talk about who we are, because as you can see, I'm not alone in this call. I'm being joined by my colleague, Jack. We're going to talk about who we are, what the Information Lab does, what is the data school as well, but then mainly about what is the Learning Hub. And this talk is very much focused on showcasing the data pipeline behind the Learning Hub. So around collecting, cleaning, and analyzing data that is being generated by the platform. We're also going to quickly explain what it is, the Learning Hub, and how we build it, or mainly around why we build it. And then we dive into the separate kind of the stack that we build. So how we can source data, how we process this data, transform it, and eventually how we present it. But more about that in a bit. Let's first of all jump into who we are. So as I said, I'm being joined by my colleague, Jack.
So hi, everyone. My name's Jack Parry. I'm a consultant here at the Information Lab. I've been in the UK team for a number of years. So when I was working on the Learning Hub, that's where I was. I've now moved over to New York to help grow and expand the team over here with Data School New York.
Cool, excellent. Well, my name is Andre, and I've been building out as kind of the product engineer, the Learning Hub itself. So I've been building the whole product from the ground up and work together with Jack on the data side of things. I'm also a Tableau ambassador and an AWS certified developer. But yeah, the main part is that we're both part of the team who built this platform, the Learning Hub. So before we jump into the data pipeline side of things, let's give a little bit of background to what the Learning Hub is. And at the Information Lab, we've kind of always been at the forefront of data analytics teaching. And we specifically focus on both Tableau and Alteryx. And we're also the creators of the data school. So Jack, for example, is now helping build out the team in the US. And we have actually trained thousands of people and companies around the world in data analytics. However, the majority of the sessions, they have been very much classroom based. So we think that's not fully inclusive yet and not very practical for those that cannot make it into the office. So that's why we decided, let's build out an online learning platform. We also decided to do this while the pandemic was going on, and it was very difficult to actually attend classroom-based training. So this way it allowed us to reach more users in the customer base that we have. Now, we have Tableau visionaries and we have Tableau ambassadors. They are creating loads of the content on the platform. We have Alteryx aces and experts in Snowflake as well. And yeah, we have mainly courses around beginner, intermediate, and advanced. So for anyone that's on their journey with Tableau and Alteryx and also AWS and Snowflake, we have something for you. The main thing for us is that we really want to focus on that you can work at your own pace. So you can do a learning path and basically set yourself kind of the time frame that you want to learn in. We have a few things on our roadmap. So if you are currently a customer of us, you can actually ask us to sign you up. We have things in there around quizzes to test your knowledge of the tools, but also certifications. If you want to learn more about Learning Hub, we have put a link at the bottom of this slide, learninghub.informationlab.io. We'll also add this link to the documentation that we put up with this webinar. One thing to mention, though, is that we are currently in closed beta. The slide that I'm now showing is a little small screenshot of how the platform looks if you are logged in as a user. You can see that this is logged in with my own account. And we have, as I said, Tableau, Alteryx, AWS, and Snowflake courses in the various different levels. We also use it as an internal learning tool. That's why you see a section about internal as well. And then we have, as I said, it's a video learning platform. So one of the pages that users land on is actually watching the video. And this is a very important page as well when we talk about the data pipeline behind the platform, because we really want to collect data around what people are watching, how long they're watching it, when they're watching it. So we can really tailor the experience of the user in the platform to what we think is good for them. So what we'll see later is when Jack talks about kind of the clickstream data that we're collecting is when you, for example, start a video or pause a video, kind of collect that data as well. Probably a question that you have now if you're watching this, how can I get access? As I said, we're currently only accepting customers of the Information Lab. So if you're currently a customer of us, we can onboard you. This is mainly because we want to make sure that we have a good product. So the current product approach is very much around creating the video courses in the platform itself and gathering feedback from our customers. Okay, so if you want to get access, we'll probably also ask you to give us some honest feedback how your experience is. So now onto the main kind of subject of today's webinar, the data pipeline itself. So Jack has been building quite a few of the components of this, and can probably give us a bit more explanation behind the reasoning of the various elements of the pipeline.
Thanks, Andre. So yeah, we had this idea that we wanted to build a very robust data pipeline for the Learning Hub. And the reason for that is because it will help us understand the usage of the platform itself. And then by understanding the usage of the platform, we can tweak the content or make changes to that platform based on how people are interacting with it. And there were a couple of goals with the data engineering pipeline when this was put to me last summer when I was building it. And the first thing is that it should be easy for anyone to be able to pick up elements from the pipeline and understand the components, because we're a small team that we're working on this. We wanted to make it easily transferable to other people to get involved. So it wasn't all just sat in my head and Andre's head. And anyone who's looking at the data should be able to see where it comes from. So we'll talk about the sources that we have in a minute. But one of those examples is Clickstream data for the page clicks. And people need to understand where exactly that has, where the source of that is. We'll talk about AWS Pinpoint in a moment. And so tight integration between the web application and the background data was really crucial. And because, as Andre mentioned, this is a new product, it's been in beta for a while, we're still iterating on it, building it, developing it. So we want to be flexible and be able to add new components to that pipeline and to those features. So we've tried to build this pipeline to be very robust, that if we do add, say, a new DynamoDB source, that will be easy to set up and configure in the future. And that's why we've opted for a serverless model, because as the platform grows and scales, we shouldn't have to worry about the resources that are thrown into the data pipeline. I just mentioned it a moment ago, but our production database is DynamoDB. We'll talk about that in a little more detail in a moment. But we didn't want to add our BI tool or Tableau, as we work with, on top of DynamoDB. So we moved the data into Snowflake, which operates as our cloud data warehouse.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is kind of the architecture that we went for. Now, we can see on the left-hand side, we have all of these different kind of source data sets, so source inputs. So we have AWS Pinpoint, DynamoDB, Mailchimp, and AWS kind of the billing. The latter one is mainly for us to understand how much we're actually spending, because we are applying this kind of serverless model. It's very important to keep on top of how much you're spending. But yeah, then we have the various components in between. Kinesis Firehose, which allows us to kind of transfer the data into an S3 bucket via Pinpoint. AWS Glue, which is AWS's version, like an ETL tool. Also, we're using AWS Lambda. It's kind of a scheduled Lambda to grab people that have signed up for the platform through the Mailchimp, so we can kind of hold track of who's actually signed up, etc. And that's all the source data. We'll dive into the individual components in a bit. But then we're using Snowflake, as you can see in the middle, as kind of our analytics database. And then we use S3 and the various stages to put that data into Snowflake. Data transformation is done by dbt, data build tool, which is very much the preparation and the transformation side of things, which works great with cloud-based databases like a Snowflake. And of course, we are visualizing the result set in Tableau. So that's kind of the only component that's not fully serverless. We're still using a Tableau server for that. So yeah, let's actually hop into the background to this pipeline a bit more. As I mentioned, we had those 4 sources. We'll kind of focus on DynamoDB and AWS Pinpoint. Mailchimp and AWS Billing is kind of something that we fairly recently added. But we've always had this thought about, hey, the production database shouldn't be in like the BI layer, right? You don't connect to your production database where there's loads of writes happening. You don't read from that as well. Also, DynamoDB is not a supported database in Tableau. So we actually decided to move that data into S3 and then read it with Snowflake. Also AWS Pinpoint, which is very much the user activity data. So that's logins, logouts, clicks on buttons, clicks on the media player, all of those things. We keep that track of that as well. I'll have a talk a little bit about DynamoDB, and then Jack will explain a bit more about how we use Pinpoint. Now, DynamoDB is AWS's kind of key value store. It's a NoSQL database. For those that have used MongoDB, it's actually goes a little bit further than Mongo. So Mongo is quite close to like SQL databases. But it's a key value store. So it's really fast to work with, and it's kind of infinitely scalable. AWS and Amazon, they use it as well for their own databases that power the Amazon website. So we already kind of knew we're a small team, and we don't really want to learn or like actually apply like scaling of databases or manage our own databases. So that's why we opted for DynamoDB. One of the design choices that we made while building the web application was to use what is called slowly changing dimensions as a way to store the data and update the data. So what that means is that if, for example, an event happens in the web application, so someone clicks on a new course, a value is being written to the database, but the next time someone clicks on that, it almost overwrites that value. So for a web application, that's great because you always have then the latest data and you don't have to do any complex filtering. For analytics, this is a bit more difficult. So we'll see in a bit how we kind of tackle that with Pinpoint. One of the things with DynamoDB is that there's a bit of a learning curve here because in SQL databases, structured databases, you often work with a primary key. You have a fixed schema, which is kind of enforced on you. You set the schema before you create the table, and then you can write values into it. With DynamoDB, you don't have a forced schema. So whenever I started developing this, I run into some issues because where certain columns they were called slightly different, and then DynamoDB all of a sudden creates a new column for you, which that flexibility is good, but also you need to make sure that somehow you're being forced to kind of follow a certain convention. But yeah, it's, as I said, we use it because it's infinitely scalable and it's fully serverless. Let's hop into Pinpoint, Jack.
Yeah, so one of the other sources that we have with the Learning Hub is AWS Pinpoint, and this collects Clickstream data. So AWS Pinpoint is obviously an Amazon Web Services service, which helps you engage with your customers across lots of different channels. So you can use the data that comes in from Pinpoint to send push notifications. You can send emails or SMS text messages. You can even send voice messages. leveraging the data in AWS Pinpoint. And how we utilize this data is by using Pinpoint's API to understand how people are interacting with the Learning Hub. So we can turn on different triggers essentially for when these messages are fired. They're just event triggers. And so, for example, whenever a video is paused or a video is played or someone completes a playlist, we will be notified. And this, at the bottom of this slide here, is a screenshot of the message that gets sent from the sort of network tab in your browser. And so you can see here that I think this is a video paused example. So we can see we've got the video there, the playlist, getting started with Alteryx, the current time, and whether that video is complete, and the percentage complete it is. So then we can use this data in the dashboard to display who's watching the most videos, whether people are completing playlists. And as we mentioned earlier, we can then act upon that information. So if we see that, you know, our getting started with Alteryx playlist is only being completed to, say, the 8th video, then maybe we need to rethink what the last 2 videos look like in that series. We could collect loads of information using Pinpoint, but we tailor it to just the specific elements that is useful for the analysis. Otherwise, we would have masses and masses of data coming through Pinpoint and through the Firehose, which is just going to increase costs due to the amount of data that we're processing.
Yeah, exactly. So let's hop into kind of the data loading side of things. So do you want to explain a little bit of how we load the data into Snowflake, Jack? Yeah,
so one of the products that we use is AWS Glue. And so this combats the part of the pipeline that is working with DynamoDB. So there's no actual transformation happening, but we use AWS Glue to take that DynamoDB data, and it's essentially just like a lift and shift. It takes it from DynamoDB and dumps it into an S3 bucket. And so you can see from our screenshot here, this is from our dev pipeline. We take our 5 tables, our 5 dev tables from Amazon DynamoDB, and drop those into S3. Those are then ready to be ingested into Snowflake. And we have this run once a day. So as Andre mentioned, with DynamoDB, the tables are slowly changing, but we don't capture any historical information in those. So by having this data move once a day, we can actually capture what the historical tables would look like if we were to use that in DynamoDB storage. So as the tables change over time, we do have those historical snapshots in S3 and therefore in our Snowflake data warehouse. With Pinpoint, we take a slightly different approach. We use Kinesis Firehose because that Pinpoint data is Clickstream data and it's just coming through all the time. The Firehose is really easy to configure. You essentially just specify your Pinpoint application, and then whenever someone interacts with the Learning Hub, it will be sending this information through the Firehose and again into an S3 bucket. So you'll see S3 is coming up a lot here, and that's because we use S3 as our external stage for loading the data into Snowflake. And again, with Pinpoint, that data comes very quickly in near real time into S3, but there's no need for us to be performing real-time analytics on the Learning Hub. So once the data's in S3, we could have set up a Snowpipe, but we figured with Snowflake, we're then going to constantly be loading this Pinpoint data into the data warehouse, whereas we only really need a once-a-day snapshot. So once that data's in S3, it won't get loaded into Snowflake until a certain time each day, again, just to keep those costs down. And then finally, with Mailchimp, we have a slightly different approach. Andre, you can speak to this because you helped configure the AWS Lambda.
Yeah. So what we're doing, so Mailchimp is a place where you do kind of transactional and marketing-based emails with your customers. They have a really good API and some great API documentation. We're kind of only scratching the surface with that one, but what I'm doing there is I think it's also similar to Pinpoint, is every day we are running an AWS Lambda, which is just scheduled, which calls that API, grabs the whole list of users that we have on the platform, and then dumps it again into S3. So we have then the various stages set up in Snowflake, and you'll see in a bit later is like the various tables that we have. Okay, so that's the data loading kind of and the extraction side of things. Then you can now we dive into the data transformation. This has been something that Jack and I have been working on together. We first did is we wrote some normal SQL, and also we used Tableau Prep Builder initially to build out almost like a proof of concept on how our transformation would look like. Because with Tableau Prep, we can really quickly iterate on that. Once we were kind of happy with how it looked, we shifted from Tableau Prep and we started using dbt, which is data build tool. And that is very much back to writing lots of SQL. dbt does lots of things very clever. Yeah, so we have in dbt every .sql file becomes is a select statement and is a model. And this really allows us to do a few things because dbt runs on top of cloud data warehouses. So the screenshot that you see on the slide here is we have some raw data coming from that S3 bucket with the data that we've loaded. It's completely raw. So we do dbt does some transformation and then almost kind of writes it within the same Snowflake instance. So it doesn't actually pull the data out. So lots of ETL and data transformation tools do that. They pull the data out of the database and then subsequently do transformations and write it back. dbt just sits kind of along your data warehouse. Besides Snowflake, dbt also supports Google BigQuery, Redshift, and quite a few other kind of cloud-based databases. But it really allows us to do quite a few things. We can do version history a lot easier. And we also have, as Jack mentioned, we have a development build and we have a production build of our platform. So that allows us to, when we build the web application, to test things in development before we push it to test or production. But the same process is applied to the data side of things. So we're applying that kind of software engineering kind of best practices of version control also to our data sides, which is, I think, is quite revolutionary. Now we're kind of trying to follow dbt best practices, but we decided to actually create first the raw tables based on the sources. So dbt often says based on kind of business questions or kind of business logic. We first decided, hey, DynamoDB gets its own kind of raw, and like the tables that come DynamoDB get their own raw table in Snowflake, and then we do transformations. So yeah, we always keep the raw data and then we're creating new tables and views that way. So yeah, as I said, some of the benefits of dbt, we have version control. So everything is fully, because we're writing SQL, you can put it in Git and any other kind of version control system, of course. A really cool one as well is the inbuilt testing. So you can test before the models are built. You can say like, hey, we want to test if there's a unique value in, say, a particular field. So your primary key might, for example, always needs to be unique. So you do a test on that, or your username column can't contain null values. So you can run tests on those as well. And defining those is literally updating a kind of a markdown or a YAML file. So that's pretty neat. The other screenshot that we see at the bottom left of this screen is the lineage graph. Basically, your whole dbt project is turned into like a kind of a graph interface where you can see where your data is coming from, the transformations that are happening. And then at the end, we see kind of an orange-red icon, which is and what they call an exposure. And exposure is then a dashboard that we have in this instance. So we can see that we have loads of event data coming in, AWS billing costs, all of those are kind of going towards that one particular dashboard. We've already got a few more dashboards, but when I took the screenshot, we literally had just one. Jack, do you want to explain a little bit more about how we set this up, the data warehouse?
Yeah, so our data warehouse of choice was Snowflake, as we've mentioned earlier in this presentation, but there are several reasons that we opted for that. The main thing with Snowflake is that we don't have to worry about like managing that database ourselves or the data warehouse ourselves. We can scale up and scale down accordingly as we see fit, but we don't really have to think about managing those resources too much. There's no fixed pricing either, so we know that we're not going to be paying a huge upfront fee for this warehouse. As the platform is small, we're not going to be charged very much. We are conscious that, you know, as it scales and as it grows, the cost will increase, but it's only going to be increasing as we use it, as opposed to paying some big upfront fee because we know that maybe in a year's time we need to have that kind of resource behind the data warehouse. It's been really easy to set up and maintain. We set this up, I think, probably towards the end of last summer, and nothing has really gone wrong since, which has just been great. It just sits there and it runs, and it's been no headache at all. And you can see from our setup with the screenshot on the right-hand side that we have several databases within our Learning Hub. So we have the one database for the Learning Hub, and then we have several schemas there. So we have our dev schema, which captures information from DynamoDB and Pinpoint. So you can see within there, we've got our raw Pinpoint table. And so our raw Pinpoint table is the data that's come from Pinpoint API through the Firehose into S3, and now it sits in Snowflake. With the other tables, such as raw media converts, for example, that is DynamoDB data that's gone through Glue into S3 and now into Snowflake. And then you can see these other views that have been produced, and they have the suffix of _dbt. And those are the tables that, as Andre was just mentioning, has used dbt to create these views, and then we can use those in Tableau. And we'll talk a little bit about why we've done that in Snowflake when I talk about the visualization itself in a moment. But you can see with the other schemas we've got our dev billing. So we do put our cost data in a slightly different schema that powers a separate report, so we can keep track of the costs from AWS and Snowflake. And then we have those replicated for our production instance of the Learning Hub. And using Snowflake is really great because it works very well with Tableau, which is our visualization tool of choice. So it's very easy to connect Snowflake to Tableau. It helps us keep the costs down. We obviously don't run off a live connection with this, because whenever someone's then interacting with the workbook, that would be incurring costs on Snowflake. But that's what makes this really easy. We can put lots of thought into how we want to manage the Learning Hub and how we can keep those costs down for us as this platform grows.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and one thing to add to that is that we just refresh the data sources, say, once a day. So in the morning, I'd say 7 before we enter the office, or we then see the latest data. So it's only like a moment in time. It's like a daily snapshot, but that is enough for us at this stage of the product to know how things are going. Talking about scheduling this, we are scheduling this whole DBT project in GitHub, so in GitHub Actions. Again, we chose GitHub Actions here because it's fully serverless in a way that we don't have to maintain any of the infrastructure here. What we do is we add a YAML file to our GitHub project. We specify when we want to run it and which commands we need to run it. We give it some credentials, and then every day at, say, 7, it runs. Typically, it takes about 1.5 minutes to run the whole thing. That's around, last time I counted, was around 40 different DBT models that are being run. So it's actually fairly quick. What it does in the background is that it spins up a Docker container. It almost kind of installs DBT, runs the whole process, shuts itself down. So that's really good. We don't have to maintain any of the infrastructure. Also, because we are only running this, say, once a day for like 1.5 minutes, we're still in the free plan. So there's no costs attached to GitHub Actions for us at the moment. One added benefit is that you can fully modify these kind of scheduled runs. So at some point, I've added kind of a little webhook that sends a message to Slack each time this process runs. So every morning I get a notification saying if it was successful or failure. It has only failed, I think, once or twice in the last 8 months. So yeah, that's great. We can fully kind of observe as well what's going on here. Let's dive into the last thing here, which is the presentation layer. And that's something that Jack has been working on a lot.
So as I mentioned, we have a Tableau dashboard that sits on our Tableau server. It's our client reporting server. So we can have an insight into how people that are using the Learning Hub are interacting with it. What are the most popular courses? At what time of day are people interacting with the Learning Hub? And we've built this in mind that we might be able to, in time, share this with clients so they could see who within their organization is utilizing the Learning Hub and making use of that benefit that we give them. We do the majority of the calculations in dbt, and that's why we have all of those views in Snowflake, because we can keep the Tableau dashboard really highly performant that way without having to build lots of the business logic into the Tableau workbook. And it also means as this grows over time and we might want to build other reports, that data source can easily be shared rather than having loads of calculations stored in our initial build and then people having to replicate those calculations in other workbooks. They can just connect to Snowflake and start to build their own analysis. And we do have a screenshot of the dashboard. It's blurred out because, as we say, there are customers using this platform, and we're not going to share their information, but we collect information about how many active users we've had in the last, say, 28 days. We've modeled this a little bit off the sort of information you would get out of a platform like YouTube. So at the moment, the view is filtered to the last 28 days, but we can look in the last week, the last 28 days, the last 3 months, and then the last year as well. We can compare that to the previous time period. So our active users, you can see from that screenshot, have gone up 211% from the previous 28 days, which is great. And we can see total views are going up, number of videos completed is going up, and the total amount of watch time is going up. So people are really making use of this platform and it's growing. And then we can see below, we can see the top users. So we can use this internally to see who's using the platform, whether that's people going through the data school program and making use of those videos, maybe consuming some of our own internal content. And then we also have those top playlists as well, and we can drill in to see which videos are popular within a particular playlist. Finally, we look at the total events by weekday and hour, so we can see what time of day that people are interacting with the platform. Being a global company, we do sometimes see odd spikes in the events by weekday and hour because sometimes you go in here and someone's been watching the Learning Hub at 3 a.m. And you're wondering what they're doing, and then you can click through, and that's what's great about it. You find out it's actually someone who's part of the Data School Australia team, and then it makes perfect sense that they'd be watching at 3 a.m. So that's an insight into some of the analysis that we pull out of the platform.
Cool. So now let's dive into some of the lessons learned really quickly by actually building out this whole pipeline. First of all, I think when Jack and I wrote this particular slide, we immediately said, okay, serverless is amazing. We need to use this a lot more. As Jack was mentioning earlier, in like the 8 to 12 months that this is running now, we haven't had to maintain any of the servers ourselves. It hasn't really fallen over. As I mentioned, 1 or 2 times the Docker containers might have not worked on GitHub, but that is just very occasionally. One of the few kind of downsides of using serverless is that because you are not maintaining any of the hardware, it's very hard to kind of observe what's going on. You just have to trust that it's good. So we have set up some integrations with Slack. So we get notifications if things happen. So not only notifications around kind of the data pipeline, I've also set up notifications around when users join the platform or when users are being invited for it. And that way we can kind of stay on top of what's happening on the platform. Another one is around kind of the costs. Serverless often starts at zero. So if you don't use it, you're not making any costs. There's not a lot of upfront costs. However, that does mean that if you start using the platform more and more, your costs can go up. They might go up rapidly. We don't really see that many costs actually related to this whole data pipeline because we've only running this like on a daily base. I think I have to check the numbers, but I think it's like $1, like $5 or something a month that we spend on this whole integration, where I think AWS Glue is almost the most expensive one.
Yeah, on AWS Glue as well, that's something that we sort of evaluated over time. So when we first deployed AWS Glue, there are a number of workers associated with each of those pipelines, and we found the costs for Glue were sort of way higher than any other part of the platform. But by monitoring the costs, we were able to drill into that, and it turns out the default number of workers applied when you've set up a sort of Glue pipeline is far more than we needed. And then it was really easy to just change the number of workers we had and bring those costs back down again.
Yeah, exactly. Also, another thing why Serverless is great, that we can incrementally build new features. So you don't have to buy a whole package of something. You can actually add little components to it, like the Mailchimp edition, for example. I've done literally 4 months after Jack built the initial data pipeline, and actually putting that in is fairly straightforward then, because everything is like individual components. One thing is, for the transformation side of things, we moved from Tableau Prep being very good in like the POC stage to DBT. And DBT has a bit of a learning curve. If you know SQL, that's great. But also DBT uses this thing called Jinja, which is almost like Python within SQL. You can do loads of really cool stuff there. I've had to learn quite a bit of Jinja to make our processes work around the dev deployment and the production deployment. And yeah, that allows us to kind of dynamically swap out which deployment I'm running the DBT models for. One of the downsides of DBT is that there's no standardized structure for your projects. So we decided to do it by individual product that we're using, so DynamoDB Pinpoint. But if you go to the DBT community, there's various ways of structuring your project. There's no kind of straightforward way of doing that. But yeah, it is great. You can deploy it anywhere you want, basically. A lot of other DBT customers use things like Airflow in other tools, but we opted for using GitHub Actions there. And yeah, it's very lightweight to use rather than some other data transformation tools that are on the market. So that kind of wraps up this whole webinar series. If there are any questions, you can pop them in the YouTube chat if you're watching it on YouTube. If you want to learn more about the Learning Hub and you might be interested in kind of upskilling your team in Tableau, Alteryx, AWS, or Snowflake, then pop us an email. I put both our email addresses on this slide, and then we can have a chat with you. But yeah, thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.